Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to this PeaceCon 2023 panel discussion on the politics of conflict response within the African peace and security architecture. My name is Hubert Kinko. I am a researcher on the African Peace and Security Governance Program at the Institute for Security Studies based in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. I will be moderating this panel discussion. First things first, we have an excellent panel that will help us discuss how the African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA, that is composed of the African Union and sub-regional organizations, how it is shaping and setting the agenda for peace in Africa. And the four panelists who will help us do this, who I will shortly introduce, will particularly unpack the nodes of convergence and divergence within and between APSA institutions, and critically reflect on the opportunities to enhance complementarity, sequencing, and coherence for effective regional response to crisis on the continent. So the aim of the session will be to examine in a critical fashion contentious norms of conflict response within APSA, the impact that APSA has had over the years, over 2 decades, on Africa's security landscape, the fragmentation and other challenges within APSA, and then the role of external actors within APSA's convergence and divergence. That said, please allow me a minute to briefly introduce the panelists who will then take the floor to share their well-founded knowledge on the subject matter in a way that we hope can allow us to further interrogate how best the possibilities and opportunities for Africa's peace and security landscape can be reaped, if APSA is fully operationalized. And so to help us unpack this are Christian Ani, who is a senior researcher and project coordinator at the Institute for Security Studies, but also a senior scholar fellow at the United States Institute for Peace. We also have on the panel Sophie DeSmith, who is the head of Peace, Security, and Resilience team at ECDPM. We equally have with us Lizelle Lovodren, who is a senior advisor, African Union at the International Crisis Group. And finally, we have Ueli Steger, who is a research and teaching fellow, medical assistant at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Geneva, who also doubles as an associate research fellow at the Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies at the United Nations University. Christian, Sophie, Lizelle, and Ueli, welcome and thank you. I will now invite each of you to take about 7 to 8 minutes to present your reflections that help us unpack this topic. It will then be followed by an interactive session, and this is for our audience. The session will be a session of moderated discussions and questions and answer session. So please do feel free to note in the chat box any comments and questions that you might have, and we will find some time to engage on these shortly after. And so without so much ado, to start us off, Christian, could you please unpack for us what the African Peace and Security Architecture's cooperation framework for conflict response in Africa looks like?
Thank you very much, Hubert, and thank you to colleagues for joining this platform. I think one thing to really understand from the nature of APSA cooperation is that, firstly, that APSA, or the African Union, and sub-regional organization are really making remarkable interventions within the continent, unlike it was, let's say, in the 1990s or maybe prior to that. And they've kind of moved from a stage of, a stage of inaction in the area of peace and security to having more African agency in peace and security response, without so much relying on saying that the UN Security Council or external actors has to be the key players within peace response field in that regard. So this map gives an idea of what the participating institutions look like. That's the institutions that make up the APSA. We have the African Union as the bigger body. Maybe this could, the middle diagram here could give an indication of that. But then we also have, sub-regional organizations, some popular ones. All of them are popular, but then you have like the Economic Community of West African States, the Southern African Development Community. We also have IGAD in East Africa. We also have another community within the East Africa region, which is also the East African Community. We have COMESA, we have CENSAT, and then we have the EAC. So all these organizations are working within a grand APSA alliance strategy that says, that kind of wants to maximize all the capacities within the continent to intervene and to respond to conflict emergencies. So, but I think one of the most understood aspect of cooperation within APSA is there's always that thought that, okay, all these institutions are independent on their own, and then, but why are they cooperating within APSA? And then who is kind of, who is the custodian or who manages this APSA network? But you see that within this grand alliance, there's a progression to it. And you see that all the sub-regional organizations were developed in the context of the OAU process, that is within the continental process. So within the early in the 1963 and then up to 1979, there were a lot of discussion about how should African integration happen. And then it is on that basis that there was a favor for a gradual kind of integration that is left at the sub-regional levels. So sub-regional organizations should lead gradual integration within their regions. Then this will all culminate at the level of the continental level at some point. Then you find the African Union or the Continental Organization now playing the lead role or the bigger role, with sub-regional organizations playing specific roles in their region. So this is a framework within which sub-regional organizations were established. The ECOWAS, for instance, established in 1975, was established on this basis and based on these talks, followed by other institutions like the Economic Community of the Central African States. So it's within this framework that they are all cooperating. And you also have within this framework a key set of mechanisms that, that allows them to cooperate and then to attach their cooperation response. One of them is the African Standby Force. Now, the African Standby Force is like a peace response mechanism, to enforce peace where necessary, to undertake peacekeeping where necessary. Similar to other regions would be institutions like NATO Response Force, for instance. You also have the EU Battle Group, for instance, that are kind of established to respond where necessary. And this Africa Standby Force has 5 regional standby forces, which are located in the 5 regions of Africa, which is North, Central, and then East, and then the Southern of Africa. You also have the, another key one is the Continental Early Warning Framework. So this is to give, as based on the name, to give that power for early response for APSA institutions, and all the recs are plugged into this continental framework. You also have some key ones like the Peace Fund. I think my colleague Ueli will also touch on this, which serves as a pot where the African Union puts in their money for conflict response. You also have the PCRD, which is the post-conflict reconciliation and development framework, where to carry out peace building in places where that are recovering from conflict. So these kind of platforms are areas where all these regs are supposed to plug into. But one of the key challenges that the APSA institution faces is that in this multitude of cooperation platform and institutions, the coordination challenge is the key issue. And one of them specifically is that there have been in the rules of engagement that the African Union and sub-regional organizations have. They have the principles of subsidiarity. They also have the principles of comparative advantage and complementarity. But when you notice, these were only mentioned in passing, almost in passing, within the MOU and the protocols of the African Union and regs. But then what happens then? There's no guidance on how this plays out when conflict response happen, when conflict challenges happen. So for instance, when in the case of whether it's in Sudan or whether it's in Mali, you really face a challenge of identifying who should be the first responder. In some ways, even though the subregions are expected to intervene early based on this principle of subsidiarity, but then you find that, as my colleagues will discuss later on, that there's a challenge of a tension brewing between the AU and regs around should the regs intervene alone without the intervention or without the support of the continental actors. And there's also challenges around how do you interpret subsidiarity within the context of comparative advantage and talking about complementarity. If the African Union joins ECOWAS to say, okay, we want to intervene in Mali, will it be more of like a big brother shadow on ECOWAS, or like ECOWAS is being taken along by the AU in that regard? So those kind of issues now make it complex for to kind of think through the determinants of responsibility within the APSA setting. So when you look at the APSA setting, there's a key number of factors that kind of determines who responds. And one of them is, which we talk about, is subsidiarity. Which region is this happening? The second part is the strength of the regs. How influential is the reg? Is the reg active? So for instance, in North Africa and East Africa, we're not sure about how active, they're not active per se. And then you find the AU struggling to meet up to that response with a lot of challenges. We also have issues of comparative advantage, which is good in many ways that actors with comparative advantage respond. And you see the AU stepping on in the situation of the Central African Republic, for instance. And then you also look at, there is also an issue of government interest on who should intervene in their crisis. So for instance, in Burundi, for instance, there was a time when the EAC was mediating, that's the East African Community, but then the AU also wanted to, play a lead role, to be more proactive, to send a peace mission there and to respond to the crisis. But in many ways, the government did not want any role for the AU, which was being more assertive for its liking. So belligerents in many ways have interest in shaping who should be the APSA actor that should play a role. And then you also have the international support or international actors playing a role in shaping, which APSA institution has the more confidence in responding than the other. So Hubert, I'll leave it here, and then I think colleagues will also input to this.
Thank you very much, Christian. What you've managed to do in those few minutes is what a lot of people will struggle to do, even in a proper policy brief about the cooperation framework that is the APSA. And you have also touched on pertinent questions, preempting some of the challenges that I think Lisa will be more expansive about as we progress. And I think 20 years, 2 decades after the establishment of APSA, which is a foundation, of a framework that the African continent should use to respond to peace and security challenges. We continue to see that the continent remains at the grips of various threats to peace and security on the continent. And so, Sophie, what then would be your reflections on the impact of APSA on Africa's security landscape over these past 2 decades?
Thank you very much, Hubert, for giving me the floor, and it's a pleasure to be here at PeaceCon this year. And yeah, I very much agree. I'm very impressed with Christian's overview. And I wanted to shed light on 3 issues that I think will help define how APSA in the future will intervene and affect the peace and security landscape in Africa. I wanted to take a bit of a forward-looking perspective. I'm sure Liesel and Uli will also take up some of these points, but I just wanted to start off by saying that I think APSA, looking at sort of impact reports or research on APSA, has really played a tremendous role in responding to security challenges on the continent. And it's really important to look at how the different components have been sort of put together in order to find the best possible response to a conflict or an urgent situation. And if you look at it, in fact, the APSA components and the different actors have displayed a great level of sort of adaptability, flexibility, have really developed a high range of diverse sort of combinations of responses with all the challenges that come with that. And Christian also alluded to that. So inevitably, when you're going to look at the impact of the APSA in the past decades, there will be positive and negative components. But I think in general, the scope and the extent of interventions deployed by APSA across, some regions more than others, for sure, is unparalleled. But I wanted to take a little bit of a forward-looking approach at 2 or 3 issues that I think will affect APSA in the future in terms of how it responds to challenges, security challenges in the region, on the continent. And they would be climate change and terrorist expansion of terrorist activities. And the third aspect would also be sort of the growing diversity of Africa's peace and security partners. Climate change has really gained more attention in the past 2 decades since the APSA has been established. We know that there are a couple of climate hotspots in Africa, and they include sort of the Sahel and Eastern Africa and the Horn, but in fact, the whole region, the whole continent is affected. And so the linkages between climate change and security is also something that the APSA actors and regional bodies are increasingly looking at. They are indirect, they're sort of messy and murky sometimes, but I think the effect of climate change on natural resources, economic development, and the pressure that climate change is exerting on existing mechanisms and processes for, intercommunal dialogue, peaceful management of resources are becoming increasingly acute, as we can see in the last 5 years. So it will have repercussions, for example, on the African Union Commission and the Peace and Security Council in terms of how they develop strategic and policy guidance, or how they develop common African positions with regards to climate change that take into account the security aspect of it. Also the African Standby Force, the role and the impact of the standby forces and military operations on their environment, sustainable use of resources, adapted material and equipment, but also on how they integrate climate change as a conflict driver in terms of how they define and develop and design their interventions. Also looking at the Peace Fund, what is going to be funded, how climate sensitive our funding by the Peace Fund going to be. And of course, all those challenges are replicated at the regional level as well. The African Union, for example, has developed a dedicated unit to climate security to really help design and integrate climate change in security considerations. Regional bodies have increasingly looked at this too, but there are great obstacles, and they are common across the APSA in terms of normative and institutional challenges, funding challenges as well, in terms of division of labor, identifying comparative advantages, who does what best, avoiding silos between policy sectors and policy communities. And I think one aspect that I wanted to mention is that I think when looking at this aspect, the APSA actors may need to establish also collaboration and connections with non-conventional partners on the continent. And I'm thinking here, for example, working with river basin organizations or smaller sub-regional organizations, or organizations that have more of a scientific or technical expertise. For example, in the Sahel, ECOWAS and UEMOA have been working with the Permanent Interstate Committee for Drought Control, which is actually a meteorological organization, but they collect climate data and science data that can, influence and feed into policy discussions on the interaction between climate change and conflict. So I think that will definitely impact the development and the impact of APSA institutions in the future. A second aspect is violent extremism and terrorism. This has been high on the agenda, I think, from the get-go, and the predecessor of the AU, the Organization for African Union, also has a long track record on adopting decisions on terrorism, but I think it has regained a bit more attention in the last 2 years, especially again also in the Sahel, but other regions as well. And also in terms of how these terrorist groups operate transnationally, that has really affected sort of how APSA is thinking about how to respond to those. There's been a launch of various multinational joint task forces, counter-terrorist operations, not just by APSA, but also by international and external actors. But I think what we've seen is that sort of the global approach or the general approach of responding to violent terrorism has not really worked so well. And they have failed to address sort of the underlying root causes, state absence, lack of inclusive approaches to governance, economic development, marginalization processes, political and economic exclusion. And so while, there have been a couple of developments to grapple with this issue, for example, doctrinal clarification on where these ad hoc security mechanisms, including the counterterrorism ones, fit into the APSA structure, etc. But I think it will require a bit more to sort of really develop connections with local responses to these challenges that are happening by the communities, and really anchoring prevention and countering of violent extremism and radicalization to these local processes. And that's something that is quite challenging for the African Union, but also regional actors that can have a bit of a distance to these processes. But I think it will be something really important to look at in the future sort of approach of the APSA. And the third aspect that I wanted to highlight shortly was just maybe more like putting a question here in the group as well on how we can keep APSA in the driver's seat in terms of looking at the growing diversity of peace and security partners, and also the money question, of course. I think African organizations have always sought to sort of diversify their partners, but I think it has been sped up a little bit in the last 2 years. Also looking at it maybe from the EU perspective with the establishment of the European Peace Fund instead of the African Peace Fund. We've seen summits with China, with Russia. And so if coordination on these issues between the APSA actors and between the AU and REX was already a challenge, I think this will only grow in the next decade, and then it will really be a question of how this diversification of security partners and the different money flows and funding that come, how they can be put to the best use of Africa and really respond to their demands and expectations funding peace and security initiatives on the continent. But I'm sure the other speakers will also allude to this. So I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to respond to any questions that come up.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think what you've done, this forward-looking approach to examining the impact of APSA over the years is certainly useful, given the ever-changing context and dynamics of Africa's peace and security landscape. One that has attracted a lot of actors, and that then forms the basis of your question around what role for APSA, amidst this competing demand that could spur cooperation, but also that is a cause of concern, for whether and how APSA's role as a driver can then be sustained, and I think it sets a very good tone for us then to hear what Liesl has to say. Liesl, having worked for several years on the governance of peace and security in Africa, something that's very close to your heart, despite the impact that has been underlined by Sophie for us. Some of the challenges that continue to hinder the full potential of APSA, we have seen relates to the fragmentation of its institutions, also including the employment of various ad hoc mechanisms, amongst many other challenges. So Liesl, how is that the case?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Hubert. And thanks for this opportunity. As you said, I will look at ad hoc mechanisms we had to deploy on the African continent to make peace and to stop conflict, and why this was necessary, as you said. What does this say about the African peace and security architecture? Do we need a new architecture? And do we really need such frameworks to guide peacekeeping solutions on the continent? The situation in Sudan, as Christian mentioned, is top of mind, and everyone is asking who should intervene here and what is the role of the African Union and the Regional Economic Community, IGAD. So I can speak more about that in the Q&A session. I'm just from Nairobi yesterday, where this was really a big discussion. So as previous speakers said, the APSA and its standby force, one of the key pillars of APSA is based on the 5 regions of Africa, the regional standby brigades. They were designed to be linked to the various regional economic communities in Southern, Eastern, Central, Western, and Northern Africa. So apart from Northern Africa, we do have fairly solid institutions based in Gaborone, Arusha, Libreville, and Abuja. The North African Regional Economic Community is very weak and struggling due to bilateral issues that many of us know about in the member states. So why was this regional configuration not used, or why did this fragmentation happen? Basically due to the shifting security landscape. The African Union and its member states have had to respond in various different ways, and it has responded. I often hear people say, oh, where's the African standby force? Well, it is not as if the African Union and member states and regional organizations have not deployed troops. It's just that it hasn't necessarily followed the original structure of the APSA. So more recently, when we look at fragmentation, what has happened? There were 3 ways one could look at it, 3 issues that arose. So firstly, what we call ad hoc mechanisms, such as the G5 Sahel to deal with violent extremism in the Sahel, and the multinational joint task force against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin, other mechanisms such as the Regional Cooperation Initiative for the elimination of the Lord's Resistance Army. They always find long acronyms for these interventions. So basically, it's called ad hoc mechanisms because, like the MNGTF, you have countries that deal with a certain issue, but they're not all belonging to, let's say, ECOWAS, the MNGTF, Lake Chad Basin countries. that are part of it, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad and Cameroon is part of Central Africa, and then the others of ECOWAS. So that's why it's sort of an ad hoc mechanism. Benin is also somewhere in there. So we've had these ad hoc mechanisms that have many challenges. And then secondly, we've had deployments by regional economic communities, which the African Union sees as part of the standby force. But in actual fact, the deployment, for example, of SADC in Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique to deal with violent extremism in 2021 was not authorized by the African Union Peace and Security Council before the deployment. And so this is not part of how the APSA standby force was constituted and designed. And also the East African community have now launched a force for Eastern DRC. And that is without actually consulting the African Union. And the protocol on the Peace and Security Council and other frameworks of the APSA actually clearly states that there should be even command and control by the African Union. So we've had those deployments. And then we've also had in the last few years bilateral peace interventions, such as those of Rwanda in Mozambique and in the Central African Republic. These have been deployed at times with a tacit agreement of the African Union, but certainly not as part of the APSA. So the question can be asked then, should the African Union coordinate these efforts, specifically those by the REX and these bilateral interventions, because it has played a role in the MNGTF, for example. So I would just like to highlight 3 points where I think, yes, the African Union has a role and it must actually make a stronger effort to coordinate. Chris spoke about the principles of comparative advantage in the relations between the African Union and the REX. So 3 issues. Firstly, the African Union has greater convening power to get everyone around the table, including some of the neighbors who are not part of that regional economic community. So we see this with Sudan, for example. You have a crisis, you have the regional economic community, IGAD, which is the first responder according to the principles of subsidiarity. But you have many neighbors like Egypt that plays a big role in the Sudan crisis that is not part of IGAD. So who should deploy? So what has happened in the last few days, and we've had 2 big meetings on the 2nd of May was the last one on Tuesday, convened by the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Commission, led by the African Union Commission Chairperson, Musa Faki Mahamat. But still people are struggling because you have this enlarged mechanism now to deal with the situation in Sudan. But the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, is the one who's dealing with the belligerents. So it is not clear, but it is, in any event, Addis Ababa have all the envoys, all the embassies of the partners. So Addis Ababa certainly has a big role when it comes to issues like these, like the crisis in Sudan. Secondly, to avoid duplication and friendly fire, as I could say, for example, we saw in Cabo Delgado, a deployment by Rwanda, as I said, but also the SADC mission in a small area, no coordination initially. Fortunately, now the generals and the force commanders on the ground are speaking to one another, so they've made sure these deployments are in different areas, but still up to date, we have not had any discussions at a very high level between President Paul Kagame, President of Mozambique, and then the regional heads of state. So we need that kind of cooperation and the African Union can play a role there. And then in the Eastern DRC, we have now several forces on the ground, but SADC is also there as part of the UN Force Intervention Brigade. The DRC is part of 3 3, 4 in the regional economic communities with the EAC, ECA, SADC, and also the ICGLR, the International Conference for the Great Lakes. So honestly, there is definitely room for coordination. And then the third point, why the AU is necessary, and I think our next speaker will address that, is the issue of funding and the Peace Fund. It is extremely expensive to fund these military interventions. And so you do need funding. We are now having new discussions these next few weeks and months on securing funding from UN assessed contributions for AU-led peace support operations. That's the other big debate. But if the UN is going to channel funding to African-led peace support operations, it has to be through the African Union, and then with this coordination with the REX. And there's a note of caution to partners as well. They risk muddying the waters, I dare say, by funding individual efforts like Rwanda in Cabo Delgado, but this is also a big debate. So if I have one more minute, Hubert, I'm sorry, I think I'm over my time, but I just want to very, very quickly highlight, you know, do we need a new architecture? And I think yes, and I can address that more broadly as we go forward, because we need, as I said, asking who's in the driver's seat, avoid duplication. But there are lots of discussions going on in the African Union currently about specifically African standby force and a better division of labor, and which mechanisms are the most appropriate. And I think Sudan is now a glaring example of where we really need new ideas, fresh frameworks to deal with all these crises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. You've done so much justice, in unpacking, some of the challenges that are hindering, Africa benefiting from the full operationalization of APSA. The issues of, the coordination gaps, the question of the AU not necessarily using its convening power to the capacity expected of it. And then, the perennial question of funding, which ULE will address for us shortly. Thank you so much. We will revisit that shortly, especially with the question you've asked about whether we do need a new architecture. And so I think ULE, your task will be a very simple task, to break down for us how much power money potentially has within the APSA.
7 hours or 7 minutes, right? No, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear you all already, and thank you to our organizers today. Indeed, difficult task, but I'll try to kind of cut beyond this discussion that's sometimes being had. There's an excellent rapper from the 90s who has a song, "More Money, More Problems," right? And it's not as simple as that. So I'd like to kind of unpack it with an optimistic and a pessimistic perspective, and then kind of going beyond just these two perspectives as well. And I'll pick up some strands that were already talked about a little bit. But in terms of this idea that money in APSA often also comes from the outside, there's an optimistic reading of this, and that would be that there is, first of all, a lot of alignment by the actors that are active, and Sophie already mentioned the European Union as one actor that, if we look in great detail, which I've done over the past few years, there's a lot of alignment with Agenda 2063 at the AU, silencing the guns, and other regional efforts as well. The AU is also much better than the critics of external funding credit it with taking money without taking the influence that might come with it. So the AU is relatively savvy in separating political mandating processes from resource mobilization on the other side. They really sort of hardwired it through processes, and sometimes also by not producing certain documents that the EU would like to sort of hook onto and shape. There are, of course, persistent post-colonial challenges around external funding, but external partners are deeply aware of this and try to push back against this rhetoric, and also are constrained by this idea of being a post-colonial power that imposes itself. The kind of conditionality that we do see, particularly from former colonial powers, is basically financial management conditionality. How does APSA actually function on the ground? How is the money spent? And there the EU is definitely in the lead. Arguably, and even AU people, when you press them on this point, will say that this is actually probably a good thing for the institution overall. Whereas conditionality is actually an attribute that we often find with non-Western partners. Gulf states come to mind, China comes to mind with conditionalities such as the acceptance of the One China principle in exchange for security sector and other kinds of support. So the AU and other APSA actors actually know how to take money with also taking influence for the most part. There's a remaining legitimacy skepticism problem, of course. And then on the Peace Fund, I'm also still carefully optimistic, even if we're very late into the ambition that was set out almost 10 years ago. Now, for the first time this year, 4 million are going to be dispersed, 5 million were authorized to the regional forests in Eastern DRC, and also to the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, through the Peace Fund. So this is really the African Union member states for the first time themselves paying for peace and security activities that go beyond mediation and go into the very costly area of peacekeeping, right? So careful optimism. Now, of course, there's also pessimism to be talked about, and here there is a fundamental problem with dependency. A student of mine recently here at university talked about funding in African security as codependency, as in psychology and sociology, where one person enables another person's self-destructive behavior, which is a cheeky way of saying that. But there are dynamics of dependency that continue, and particularly it's a challenge that external funding is not yet more than just filling a funding gap. It is not strengthening the institution while filling the funding gap. And this is something that's not currently happening in APSA. It's often sort of responding short-term rather than building up in the long term for financial viability without external funding. And another reason for pessimism is that different external funding arrangements can also be out of step with the institution's own financial processes. The EU and the African Union, for example, have worked on certain projects that then ended up being never implemented simply because the African Union has a budget ceiling that this didn't fit into. And this is difficult for institutions to handle, and creates quite a bit of turmoil, so to say. But I think the biggest and most problematic cause for pessimism around funding of APSA is what I call external funders as arbiters of subsidiarity. And the previous speakers have already put the finger really well on what this is and what the challenges around this is, also around the convening power, etc., of the African Union. And so ex post, we always see these missions were set up and eventually funded, and international support has been provided, and it looks clean and rational, so to say. But before this clean and rational result, there's deeply political processes going into this, in which basically the availability of funding for certain things and certain themes shapes the plausibility of African APSA stakeholders to go ahead with certain ideas. So no APSA actor can act and plan without external funding in mind, and that shapes sort of the conditions of possibility of what can be done and what cannot be done. And I think that's really a role and a responsibility that actors such as the European Union are quite uncomfortable about, and they deny it for the most part. Similarly, external actors are a driver of ad hoc responses, where the jury is still out whether they support APSA as it was established, or whether they create an alternative competing framework through which to conduct peace and security. And I'd say even the UN-AU discussion that Liesl previously alluded to around UNSS contributions for AU peace support operations is missing the opportunity to keep in step with the nature of threats and also practices of African security. And that's something that's a big question in the room. Maybe a last point, as I'm running out of time, would be around just managing diversification. And there Sophie made an interesting point in that there's two discourses on this. On the one side, there's the EU that fears if it pulls out, another actor will come in. Research that we've done that will be coming out in a few weeks as a report for the European Parliament shows that there's really no one to take this massive role of the European Union in APSA in the short to medium term. But what we see at the same time is a number of small projects that each require a management structure, a bureaucratic architecture, and a political dialogue as well, that keep the institution busy and ultimately distracted from core business. So it's about managing diversification that many APSA actors have not yet succeeded at completely. I'll stop here, and we can maybe get back to my last point, which is also important, but not quite as important as what I've said already now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yurli. I think, moving very carefully between, your cautious optimism and, the pessimistic views on issues pertaining to funding within APSA, nuances the conversation around funding in a very balanced way, and of course sets the stage for a lot of questions to be raised and a lot of interrogation around the future of funding for APSA, but also extends, the conversation around what role, external partners can continue to play within APSA. So thank you, and thanks to all the panelists as well for, these thought-provoking reflections on this subject matter. So I think at this point, it'll be good to open the floor to see if there are any questions, and then we can continue to unpack some of these things that you have touched on. So if there's anyone who would like to comment or raise a question, please do feel free to unmute yourself and raise your question. Okay, there are a few questions that I have in the absence of any interventions from the floor. Just perhaps a round for all the panelists to reflect on some of the key issues that came out as you spoke. So first, Christian, when you were talking about the framework, the APSA framework, of course, established 2 decades ago, what would you think are the key changes to the mechanisms within APSA, that have been experienced that we can see over this period, especially with respect to the African Standby Force, for example. So if you could unpack that for us, that would be very helpful. And for Sophie, you made a very good connection, between climate change and the securitization of the same within APSA, within the African Union. How do you think that APSA institutions have responded to climate change and security challenges over these past 20 years? And in relation to that, what are some of the key challenges that center responses to countering violent extremism and terrorism around human security in Africa? Lizel, you did close your presentation with a very loaded question around literally the future of APSA. Do we need a new peace and security architecture, as it were? And so I'm wondering for you to help us unpack that a little more. Do you think that the deployment of various ad hoc mechanisms that you talked about translate to the African Standby Force no longer being viable? Is that what it means? Is there a sense in which it has been overtaken by the situations on the ground? Can we say confidently that the African Union is still in control of peace and security initiatives on the continent? Or have we seen a sort of situation where the AU has taken a backseat role and ceded the responsibility of that to the regions? So if that is the case, if you could also unpack for us what the implications of this would be, that would be very helpful. And then, Yureli, in what sense do you think African regional organizations can ensure that partners' funding remains aligned to priorities within the continent? And if you can also establish for us the institutional cause and effects of funding ad hoc coalitions, as you unpack that, I think that will also be useful. So you can please take a round to respond to those sets of questions, as we hope there might be more questions coming from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if I should start since I started speaking
Yes,
earlier.
you may.
But yeah, okay. But I think after mine, Lizel could speak soon after, or you can start, then I'll join in. Lizel.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for all the other interventions. That was really very, very interesting. Yes, maybe we can use this opportunity with so many great minds in the room to reflect amongst ourselves, on these questions. I think, so when we talk about fragmentation, actually, of the African peace and security architecture, on a deeper level, are we looking at fragmentation of African unity, really, and that the whole project, and whether regions, are we going to see a huge, very strong ECOWAS that rivals, and if you look at regional military interventions, in the Sahel and so on, really ECOWAS takes charge, political intervention, as we've seen in the Gambia and all these places where there were coups these last couple of years. So is that in the direction that we are going, or are we going to give the African Union the opportunity to strengthen its, as I was talking about, the convening power and its role in command and control, channeling funds from the UN? In what direction is this going? And I honestly think these last couple of years, I mean, maybe in 2019, this would have been a different discussion, but the African Union, I think ordinary African citizens have seen that the African Union can actually play its role. It was COVID-19, the African Union played a role as speaking on behalf of the continent when it came to, vaccines. I know we're a bit, I'm going off topic with, we're talking about peace and security, but we are talking here about the usefulness of the African Union. So we saw that the war in Ukraine and the impact on food security, and the African Union, really trying to speak on behalf of the continent. And now again, we're trying to be a stronger, united entity when it comes to this new Cold War or scramble for Africa's minerals and so on. So the fragmentation of APSA, I think the rethink has to come there, adapting the African standby force, and then the other mechanisms that we have as part of APSA. We have the pillar, the early warning, which doesn't really, it's been completely configured. It doesn't really exist anymore in the structure of the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department. And then we have the panel of the wise, and we have the standby force. Of course, the Peace and Security Council itself, which is constantly being updating its working methods. Now we have a whole new rethink about how many members, the 15 members of the Peace and Security Council, because North Africa only has 2 members and so on. So new ideas, maybe to replace the APSA in its current form, but the fact that regions are jumping in without authorization around the African Union, the fact that Rwanda deploys across the continent with no discussion, the African Union, I think are alarm bells, and the African Union should not impose itself, but citizens, leaders, member states of the African Union should amongst themselves, realize that there's a problem, and, we need, as I said, new imaginative solutions. That's all.
Thank you, Lizel. Sorry, Hubert. I wanted Lizel to speak because there's a whole lot of significant context to my further input, especially on the ASF and the situation she was talking about. The issues between AU and REX. Well, to say it quite frankly, when you go to each other's secretariat, the commission here within ECOWAS, and you go to the AU commission, there is a virtual bad blood sometimes between AU and REX, especially stronger REX. So when I'm talking about stronger REX, I'm talking about REX like ECOWAS and then maybe SADC. The intent here is that REX want to act autonomously, as in with significant autonomy in their response. And it comes with a lot of experience over the years of what has happened. It comes in with AU coming in to impose itself, especially for ECOWAS. One of the turning points was the 2012 Mali crisis, where the ECOWAS was planning to intervene in the mission via MISEMA, which went to become MISMA and then AFISMA. Then the AU came out of, towards the end of the whole discussion to say it's sending a special envoy to serve as the head of the mission that ECOWAS is establishing. So that puts ECOWAS off guard. While there's no significant discussion around this, within interviews that I've done within ECOWAS department and the AU, they're literally saying no, they want AU to just sit down, support resource mobilization efforts, and listen to what sub-regional organizations have to say in intervention, and then just endorse, put in the endorsement cap, which the AU does in most of the decisions anyways. So, and it's also reflecting currently when you look at most of the interventions around the continent. Now it's sub-regions and then the regional mechanisms. The AU is in Somalia, that's it. After the Somalia case, it will be very, very difficult for us to see where the AU is able to still muster a continental support, a continental or wide-reaching support like the way it has for Somalia. And this is, trickling down to what is happening within the African Standby Force. Firstly, within the African Standby Force, there is a strong sense of talk about, which Lizu mentioned, that, look around flexibility. That the Lizu was talking about, how we can, update this architecture, but a talk around how to maintain this architecture, the current architecture, is about, thinking around how do we infuse flexibility within the system to say, okay, though we have this framework, but things don't always happen as frameworks. We have the frameworks as a guidance. So in the Gambia, for instance, the AU acknowledged that the ASF was deployed to the Gambia, but how many member states of ECOWAS intervenes? Just about 5. Senegal, Nigeria, quickly deployed there, and that was it. And it's not composing of all the required members. The EAC is intervening. It says it wants to intervene in the DRC, but the components of the standby force that is intervening also has members of IGAD. So we are now having IGAD, EAC deploying, saying, we're trying to see the EAC's regional standby force, is it of the ESF or it's just a component? That's where flexibility of thoughts are now coming in. People are now saying, okay, no, members who really wants to deploy should be the ones to deploy in that context. And what Lizo's talked about again on the authorization, it is becoming a standard practice that regional organizations will intervene and then often go back to the UN Security Council to then seek for authorization. But when you look at the context of Africa, it's different. I try to put it that it's not the same framework that, let's say, other sub-regional organizations, other regional organizations work with, and they relate with the UN. For the AU and REX, they're more like symbiotic relationship that is involved in the relationship in such a way. So for instance, the SADC deployment to Mozambique, when it came back to the AU after 6 months to ask for authorization, which Lizel have also written a lot about, it's now asked the AU to support resource mobilization. Now the AU had to open up its continental logistic base in Douala to then provide support to this mission. But if it had spoken earlier to the AU, those supports will have already been there. There will have already been, that coordination and how to use this same pool of resources that belongs to the continent about maximizing continental response. So I'm putting out there that, there's a whole discussion about infusing flexibility within the whole APSA plan. But then there is a significant need to reconfigure and think through how should this, even if it's going to continue being as flexible as possible, but how should it reflect in AU norms in the thinking within the architecture? So sorry, Hubert, I've spoken a lot, but I thought it's good to highlight those.
Oh, I think Hubert has.
Yeah.
Looks like he's. Maybe I can just respond to you, Chris, while we wait for Hubert. I don't want to monopolize. But we see in, let's say now in Sudan, we really don't have time. It's that's why, and we do need frameworks. We do need some kind of guidance. You know, I was sitting there in Nairobi, people coming up and say, okay, so who is it, the AU? Is it IGAD? You know, bombs are dropping on Khartoum. Now, can you imagine Sudanese themselves who are absolutely fed up with the African Union in any case because of everything that had happened in the past, and then international actors who want to help but who want to have African solutions are completely confused. And AU Rex, you know, there needs to be firm guidelines so that it's not ad hoc solutions, and flexibility is what we need. And you're absolutely right. But what we also need is some guidelines, firm guidelines that we can rely on in times of crisis to say, right, my solution that I put forward was, look, the Peace and Security Council is the highest decision-making body on peace and security in the continent. So Uganda is now chairing the Peace and Security Council this month. So get the Peace and Security Council at the level of heads of state, because obviously that's what we need, heads of state. Get IGAD, and then let the Peace and Security Council meet. But obviously that solution didn't fly because IGAD just said, no, you know, it's us and heads of state, and we're going to subsidiarity. But as I said, we have Egypt, we have Libya, we have all these other actors that are also around neighbors. Hubert, you're back. Sorry, I jumped.
Thanks, Lizzo. Yes, and I think we have about 8 minutes or so. So perhaps Sophie and Yuli, your inputs at this point.
Thanks. I actually wanted also to ask a question about what the capacity was for APSA actors to have this kind of looking back at what they had done in the past and what worked and what didn't, and to take that reflection with them as they develop new responses to crises that come along. So I don't know if someone wants to take that question first, or I'm happy to provide answers to the question that you set out, Hubert, on sort of how the APSA actors have looked at climate change.
Yes, I think you can respond to the questions I raised, and then during the parting shots, perhaps one of the panelists can respond to the question.
Sure. Yeah, I think the APSA actors or the AU and the REX have done a lot, and I think it comes back to sort of then operationalizing and implementing some of these decisions that they've taken. I mentioned the dedicated unit that is quite high up in the Commission in terms of looking at climate security issues. There's also been political declarations, for example, the Bamako Declaration on sort of access to natural resources and conflicts between communities. There are various departments within the EU Commission that look at development, security, humanitarian aspects, social development as well, that have tried to work more together and explore synergies. I think as part of this as well, the interdepartmental task force on conflict prevention has been reinvigorated a bit to also look at these issues. But there are other aspects or components of the APSA that could be further strengthened. The early warning system, for example, it's not clear how climate change is featuring in that work and how they are also feeding policy discussions and decisions. This is also something that we see at the regional level. We know that the West Africa Network on Peacebuilding has integrated climate change in their monitoring, but the connection with ECOWAS policymakers is not always optimal. So those are definitely aspects that can be strengthened. Again, at the level of regional, we see also the same sort of challenges. We know, for example, that mobility and migration is an important way to adapt to climate change, but also security challenges. But conventions on pastoralism and transhumance are not always implemented or operationalized effectively. And that's quite important if you look at the growing conflict between pastoralist communities and farmers, when pastoralist communities have to adapt their migration routes because of climate change, but also because of security. So the nexus is really quite acute and urgent. And so establishing frameworks is one thing, but then also operationalizing and living up to the conventions that have been adopted is a challenge. And I think one way of looking at this is, for example, resilience, because climate change has that innate challenge of being a long-term thing. It's not just responding short-term to disaster, etc., but it's really about strengthening community resilience. And I think what the APSA actors strengthen with now is really to make that connection to strategies for peaceful conflict resolution and natural resource management that are already happening at the level of communities, and really plugging into those and strengthening those, and making sure that communities that are in the fire line of responding to these get the effective support. So I think that's going to be a huge challenge with regards to climate security.
Thanks, Sophie. We don't have a lot of time, so Yueli, your reflections.
Yeah. No, I think it's such a fascinating conversation, and I like how Sophie gave us the issue of climate security as one of the many newer issues to kind of deal with, drawing together different questions and strands here. I think I just want to recall that APSA was a great idea implemented to the best of knowledge of decision makers in the late 90s. And so I'm not particularly surprised that it needs adjustment today. What I'm surprised at is the lacking collective enthusiasm to do it, right? So it's the adjustment I find logical, but the delivering on the adjustment, doing it in an orderly and kind of guided way, maybe is lacking. And Sophie, your question on kind of lessons learned is how I interpreted it. I don't think it's an APSA strength. I don't think it's an AU strength. Part of this has to do with a fear of thought leadership, on leaning outside the window, a heavy reliance on consultants that are often from the African continent, but not often enough, if I may say so. And then a final kind of factor that I'd like to add is just that regional collective security is really hard to do. Christian mentioned the EU battle groups, fantastic on paper, never deployed in their history, basically, discontinued effectively. So the measuring stick is also an important concept here. And so I think what we're seeing now is basically a lot more informality around the APSA institution, and they're kind of drawing on the literature on international organizations. I can say that elsewhere we see that this can work to enhance the vitality of an organization. So now the question is to make sure that states have this willingness to deal with informality, to further informality, to do ad hoc coalitions, but also to be better at integrating the benefits and the public goods that these create. So here I'm going to conclude on an optimistic note from my side.
It is such a good note to conclude on, Yueli. Thanks. And I think in a nutshell, all the reflections are pointing to the fact that, of course, all the normative frameworks that have laid down the institutional structure, that is the APSA, actually serve as a great example of what, of how collective security can actually be systematized in this day and age with changing peace and security dynamics, including COVID, Liesel, which, is also considered a conventional security threat alongside climate change that Sophie has talked about. But its operationalization has actually produced mixed results. On the one hand, Sophie has showed us some of the impacts that have been positive. On the other hand, Liesel has expounded for us, some of the challenges, some of the ways in which it has fallen short to meet expectations. in delivering on a number of conflicts on the continent. And the conversations have all detailed some of the reasons owing to this, including that the instruments are not properly functioning, or that sometimes the intervention regimes continue to be ignored, or that even compliance mechanisms fail to be adhered to. But also the fact that the AU perhaps is outmaneuvered by other actors within this space. And so for me, it's the conversation continues, but the central question remains, what is the future of peace and security in Africa and the vital role of APSA? How can we get to an APSA that is characterized by delivery, by successful cooperative conflict management on the continent, by cooperation between intervening actors, the AU, the REX, the regional mechanisms, and other partners, in a way that essentially leverages their comparative advantages that Chris was highlighting in a manner that is timely, that is proactive, and with interventions that are actually efficient, that essentially lead to overall improved continental stability in Africa. So I think the conversations have left us with important questions for future consideration. And at this point, I would like to say thank you very much to Chris, to Lizelle, to Sophie, and to Yeli for those thought-provoking reflections and the nuances in between, and to urge that we take this conversation forward outside of this panel conversation. So I don't know if you have 10 seconds each, if you have any parting shot, or you want us to leave it at this. Okay. In the absence of that, I would like to say thank you and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Hubert.
Thank you so much, Hubert. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.